The bustling frontier town of Silverton, Colorado, fell silent as Beatrice Holloway's carriage rolled down Main Street, the autumn sun of 1879 casting long shadows across her unwelcome arrival. Every face that turned toward her carried the same expression, curiosity quickly souring into judgment, just as they had in every town before. Beatrice clutched her weathered medical bag tighter, knowing her reputation had preceded her yet again. "Another town, another chance," she whispered to herself, though the knot in her stomach suggested otherwise. At 26, Beatrice was unlike any woman the Western Territories had encountered. Her formal medical education from Philadelphia's Women's Medical College made her an oddity. Her insistence on wearing practical trousers beneath her skirts when working made her scandalous, and her outspoken views on women's capabilities made her dangerous. Three ingredients that had gotten her driven from 4 towns already. The stagecoach driver unloaded her trunks with obvious distaste. "Miss Holloway, your arrangements at the boarding house, 3 blocks down." He couldn't meet her eyes, as if her unconventional ideas might be contagious. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar ache of rejection settling in her chest. Beatrice had come to Silverton with purpose. The mining town desperately needed a doctor after their previous physician had abandoned them for the goldfields further west. The town council had agreed to her appointment through correspondence, likely because she'd carefully omitted certain details about herself in her letters. As she made her way to the boarding house, whispers followed. A pair of women crossed the street to avoid her path. She'd grown accustomed to this treatment, but it never ceased to hurt. Mrs. Gladys Winters, the stern-faced proprietor of the boarding house, greeted her with pursed lips. "Miss Holloway, I've prepared the room at the back. I must inform you that I run a respectable establishment." "I assure you, Mrs. Winters, I am quite respectable myself," Beatrice replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. "That remains to be seen. No gentlemen callers, no patients in your room, no inappropriate attire in common areas. The town council may have hired you out of desperation, but that doesn't mean we approve of. You're kind. You're kind." The words that followed Beatrice everywhere, as if being a female doctor made her a different species entirely. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a simple desk beneath a window overlooking the mountains. Beatrice unpacked her medical textbooks and instruments with care, arranging them on the desk, as she always did, creating a small sanctuary of science and reason in a world that seemed to have little use for either. Tomorrow, she would open her practice in the small office the town had provided. Tonight, she would allow herself a few tears of frustration before steeling herself for the battle ahead. Miles Reynolds rode into Silverton with nothing but his horse, Samson, 2 saddlebags of possessions, and a reputation that traveled faster than he did. At 30, he'd seen enough of the West to know that a man was judged by what he could do, not who he was, and Miles could break any horse that walked on 4 legs. "Heard you're the best horse trainer this side of the Mississippi," the livery owner had written in his letter, offering Miles a position that promised good pay and relative stability. After years of drifting from ranch to ranch, the prospect of staying in one place appealed to him more than he cared to admit. His first morning in town, Miles woke before dawn and headed to the livery. The owner, a gruff man named Jenkins, showed him around the stables and the adjacent corral where his work would be done. "Got a real hellion for you to start with," Jenkins said, nodding toward a powerful black stallion pacing in a separate pen. "No one's been able to get near him without nearly losing a limb." Miles observed the horse carefully, noting the intelligence in its eyes. "He's not mean, just scared and confused. Give me a week," Jenkins laughed. "If you're still walking after a week with that devil, I'll be impressed." By mid-morning, Silverton had begun its daily bustle. Miles worked patiently with the black stallion, spending hours just sitting near the pen, speaking in low tones, letting the animal grow accustomed to his presence. This was his gift, understanding that beneath every wild exterior was a creature seeking connection. It was while focused on this task that he first noticed the woman. She walked purposefully down the street, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. Her hair was a rich chestnut color pulled into a practical bun, her dress simple but well made, and she carried a leather bag that looked like it might contain medical instruments. "Who's that?" Miles asked Jenkins when the livery owner brought him water. Jenkins spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "New doctor, if you can call a woman that, Beatrice Holloway. Town council hired her before they knew what they were getting." "What were they getting?" Miles raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Trouble. Woman thinks she can do a man's job, wears trousers sometimes if you can believe it. Been run out of other towns for her radical ideas." Jenkins shook his head. "She won't last long here either." Miles watched as a mother pulled her children to the opposite side of the street when Dr. Holloway approached. The doctor's face remained composed, but Miles recognized the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in the eyes of too many wild horses, pride and pain in equal measure. "Seems to me," Miles said slowly, "that anyone willing to face that kind of treatment must have a mighty strong calling." Jenkins snorted. "Don't you go getting sweet on her, Reynolds. This town has standards." Miles didn't respond, but he watched until Beatrice Holloway disappeared into a small building with a freshly painted sign. B. Holloway, M.D., Beatrice's first week in Silverton passed slowly. Her small office remained mostly empty, save for a few miners with injuries too severe to let pride stand in the way of treatment. Each man who reluctantly sought her help left with surprise evident on his face, surprise that a woman could set a bone, stitch a wound, or prescribe appropriate medicine. Still, the women of the town avoided her entirely. At church on Sunday, she sat alone in the back pew, enduring the disapproving glances and whispered comments, unnatural, playing at being a doctor. "No wonder she's unmarried." Beatrice held her head high, though each word stung. After the service, she walked back to her boarding house alone, taking the long route past the livery to avoid the cluster of churchgoers on Main Street. As she passed the corral, she noticed a man working with a magnificent black stallion. The horse was clearly spirited, yet the man moved with such quiet confidence that the animal seemed mesmerized. Beatrice paused, watching the gentle way he spoke to the horse, the respect evident in every movement. "He's beautiful," she said before she could stop herself. The man turned, and Beatrice was struck by his eyes, a clear, penetrating blue that seemed to look right through pretense. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "He is," the man agreed. "Most folks just see the wildness, but there's a remarkable spirit underneath. People often fear what they don't understand," Beatrice replied, thinking not of the horse. A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Miles Reynolds," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "New horse trainer at Jenkins Livery. Beatrice Holloway, I'm the new doctor." She waited for the familiar change in expression, the drawing back, the sudden coolness. Instead, Miles nodded thoughtfully. "Must take considerable courage to practice medicine out here, especially as a woman." Beatrice blinked, surprised by his matter-of-fact tone. "Some would call it foolishness rather than courage. Some folks can't tell the difference," he said with a slight shrug. Before Beatrice could respond, Mrs. Winter's voice cut through the air. "Dr. Holloway. This is hardly appropriate Sunday behavior, consorting with strange men at the livery." Beatrice flushed. "Good day, Mr. Reynolds," she said stiffly, turning to follow Mrs. Winters. "Good day, doctor," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that stayed with her long after she'd returned to her lonely room. The following Tuesday brought Silverton's first mining accident since Beatrice's arrival. A cave-in at the Blue Ridge mine left 3 men injured, 1 critically. She received word mid-morning and rushed to the site, medical bag in hand. A crowd had gathered, and the mine foreman looked alarmed when she approached. "Where's the doctor?" he demanded. "I am the doctor," Beatrice stated firmly. "Now, please take me to the injured men." The foreman hesitated, looking around as if hoping a male physician might materialize. When none did, he reluctantly led her to where the injured miners lay. The first 2 had relatively minor injuries, a broken arm and a gash that required stitches. The third man, however, had a crushed leg and was losing blood rapidly. Beatrice worked quickly, applying a tourniquet and assessing the damage. "This man needs immediate surgery," she announced. "I need him transported to my office at once." "Surgery, by you," The foreman looked horrified. Unless you'd prefer he bleeds to death while you search for a male doctor who doesn't exist within 50 miles, Beatrice replied sharply. 4 miners carefully lifted their comrade onto a makeshift stretcher. As they made their way toward town, Beatrice spotted Miles Reynolds among the onlookers. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a nod of encouragement that somehow steadied her for what lay ahead. The surgery lasted 3 hours. Beatrice had to amputate the lower portion of the miner's leg to save his life. Throughout the procedure, a small crowd gathered outside her office, many expecting disaster. When she finally emerged, exhausted but successful, the crowd fell silent. "He'll live," she announced. "He needs round-the-clock care for the next few days." "I'll stay with him," a miner's wife volunteered unexpectedly. "My Patrick worked with him. It's the Christian thing to do." Beatrice nodded gratefully. As the crowd dispersed, she noticed Miles leaning against a hitching post across the street. He straightened when he saw her and crossed over. "That was something to see, doctor," he said quietly. "Not the surgery, though I reckon that was impressive too, but the way you stood your ground when everyone expected you to fail." Beatrice's professional composure nearly cracked at his words. No one had ever acknowledged her daily battle before. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Sometimes standing one's ground is all one can do." "Miles," he corrected. "And sometimes it changes minds. Those miners won't soon forget who saved their friend." A week later, Beatrice found her office unexpectedly busy. The miner whose leg she'd amputated was recovering well, and word of her skill had spread through the mining community. Still, the women of Silverton remained distant, their disapproval undiminished. One evening, as Beatrice was closing her office, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Miles standing there, hat in hand. "Mr. Reynolds, is everything all right?" "Miles," he reminded her with a small smile. "And yes, except I seem to have this cut that needs looking at." He held up his hand, revealing a gash across his palm. Beatrice ushered him in, though she suspected the wound wasn't as accidental as he claimed. "How did this happen?" "Carelessness with a harness knife," he said, watching as she cleaned the cut. "Though I must admit, it gives me an excuse to speak with you properly without Mrs. Winter's crying scandal." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "And what did you wish to speak about?" "I thought you might join me for a ride this Sunday. There's a meadow about 5 miles out of town full of wildflowers this time of year. Good place for a picnic." Beatrice's hands stilled. "Mr. Reynolds, Miles, you should know that association with me isn't advantageous in this town." "Fortunately, I've never much cared for advantages," he replied, his blue eyes holding hers. "Just honest company." Against her better judgment, Beatrice found herself agreeing. As she finished bandaging his hand, their fingers touched briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through her. "Sunday, then," Miles said as he left. "I'll bring a horse for you, one gentle enough for a city-raised doctor." Beatrice stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, wondering what had possessed her to accept his invitation, and why the prospect filled her with such anticipation. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Beatrice dressed carefully in her riding outfit, a divided skirt that allowed her to ride astride rather than side saddle, but still maintained a degree of feminine propriety. Mrs. Winters looked scandalized when Beatrice came downstairs. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" "Riding," Beatrice replied simply. "The fresh air will do me good." "With that horse trainer, I presume," Mrs. Winters sniffed. "I've seen how he looks at you. It's not proper, Dr. Holloway, not proper at all." Beatrice squared her shoulders. "My personal time is my own, Mrs. Winters. I'll be back before dark." Miles was waiting at the livery with 2 saddled horses, his own stallion, now remarkably calm, and a gentle bay mare. "You've worked wonders with that horse," Beatrice observed as she approached. Miles patted the stallion's neck. "Thunder just needed someone to believe in him. Most creatures do." His eyes lingered on her face, making her wonder if he was speaking of more than the horse. They rode out of town, conscious of the stares that followed them. Once beyond Silverton's limits, however, Beatrice felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The open country spread before them, mountains rising majestically in the distance. "You ride well," Miles commented. "Not many ladies sit a horse with such confidence." My father believed all his children should learn useful skills, regardless of gender, Beatrice explained. He encouraged my interest in medicine from an early age, though my mother worried it would make me unmarriageable. And has it? Miles asked, his tone carefully neutral. Beatrice laughed softly. I've been too busy proving myself to consider marriage. Besides, most men don't want a wife who might question their judgment or earn her own living. Most men are fools then, Miles replied simply. The meadow, when they reached it, was everything Miles had promised, a sweeping expanse of grass dotted with wildflowers in every color. They dismounted near a stand of aspens, and Miles spread a blanket while Beatrice unpacked the lunch he'd brought. As they ate, Miles told her about his life growing up on a failing farm in Missouri, leaving home at 16 to make his own way, discovering his gift with horses that had carried him through the West. What about family? Beatrice asked. Do you have siblings? A shadow crossed Miles' face. Had a younger sister, Elizabeth. She died of scarlet fever when I was 14. The doctor came too late. He was drunk when he arrived. That's when I learned that wearing a title doesn't make a man worthy of it. He looked at her intently. And not having one doesn't mean a person can't save lives. I'm sorry about your sister, Beatrice said softly. Miles nodded. It's what makes what you do so important, Beatrice. You care. I've watched you these past weeks. You treat every patient with respect, whether they return it or not. It's my duty, she said, though his words touched her deeply. It's more than duty, Miles countered. It's who you are. As the afternoon progressed, they walked through the meadow, gathering wildflowers and talking about books they'd read, places they'd seen. Beatrice couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease with another person, especially a man. When it came time to return to town, Miles helped her mount the mare, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. The touch sent a flutter through Beatrice that both alarmed and excited her. They rode back in companionable silence, both aware that their easy camaraderie in the meadow would face scrutiny in Silverton. Sure enough, as they approached town, Beatrice could feel the weight of judgment settling back onto her shoulders. Thank you for today, she said as they reached the livery. It was liberating. Miles helped her dismount, keeping hold of her hands after her feet touched the ground. Beatrice, I'd like to see you again, not just on Sunday rides. Before she could respond, the sheriff approached, his expression grim. Dr. Holloway, there's been an accident at the school. The teacher's son fell from the roof. He's badly hurt. Beatrice immediately shifted into her professional demeanor. I'll come at once. Miles, thank you again. As she hurried away with the sheriff, she glanced back to see Miles watching her. His face holding an expression she couldn't quite define. Admiration, certainly, but something deeper too. Something that made her heart beat faster despite the emergency awaiting her. The teacher's son, 10-year-old Timothy, had a concussion and a broken arm. Beatrice set the bone and stayed with him through the night, monitoring his condition. To her surprise, the teacher, Mrs. Ellis, treated her with genuine gratitude rather than the usual reserve. You've been so kind to my Timothy, Mrs. Ellis said as dawn broke and the boy's condition stabilized. I must confess, Dr. Holloway, I misjudged you based on town gossip. It happens frequently, Beatrice replied without bitterness. Well, it shouldn't, Mrs. Ellis said firmly. A doctor who sits up all night with a child deserves respect, not scorn. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Silverton. Timothy's recovery brought Beatrice more patients, women and children who had previously avoided her. Miles, meanwhile, had become a frequent visitor to her office, sometimes with minor injuries that needed attention, sometimes simply bringing coffee and conversation at the end of a long day. One evening in late October, Beatrice was startled by an urgent knocking. She opened the door to find Miles, his face taut with worry. It's Jenkins, he said. Heart attack, I think. He collapsed at the livery. Beatrice grabbed her bag and followed Miles through the darkening streets. They found Jenkins on the livery floor, gray-faced and struggling for breath. Despite the man's previous disdain for her, Beatrice worked frantically to save him, administering medication and instructing Miles on how to help. For hours, they fought for Jenkins' life. When the livery owner finally stabilized near dawn, Miles insisted on walking Beatrice back to her boarding house. You're exhausted, he observed as they walked slowly through the quiet streets. "It's part of being a doctor," she replied. "The hours are rarely convenient." Miles stopped walking, turning to face her. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? The sacrifice, the judgment, the loneliness?" Beatrice considered the question. "Sometimes, but then I remember why I became a doctor, to help people, to make a difference. That purpose sustains me even when everything else feels impossible." "You're the bravest person I've ever known," Miles said, his voice low and intense. "Most folks run from what makes them different. You embrace it, even when it costs you." Beatrice felt suddenly vulnerable under his gaze. "It's not bravery so much as stubbornness. Call it what you will," Miles replied, taking a step closer. "To me, you're perfect." The words hung in the pre-dawn air between them. Before Beatrice could respond, Miles gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. When they finally broke apart, Beatrice felt dizzy, and not from exhaustion. "Miles, I love you, Beatrice," he said simply. "I've known it since I watched you fight for that miner's life. You don't have to say anything now. Just know that to me, everything that makes others shun you only makes me admire you more." News of their courtship spread through Silverton like wildfire. Some disapproved, but others, particularly those whose lives Beatrice had touched as a physician, defended the relationship. Jenkins, recovering from his heart attack, became an unexpected ally. "Reynolds saved my livery while the doctor saved my life," he told anyone who would listen. "Seems to me they deserve some happiness." As winter settled over the mountains, Beatrice found herself experiencing a kind of acceptance she'd never known before. More and more women came to her for medical care, and she was even invited to join the Ladies' Aid Society, an invitation she accepted with quiet gratitude. Miles continued his work with horses, earning a reputation throughout the region for his gentle but effective methods. He and Beatrice spent every available moment together, their bond deepening with each passing day. On Christmas Eve, Miles proposed. They stood on the boardwalk outside Beatrice's office, snowflakes swirling around them in the glow of the street lamps. "I can't offer you an easy life," he said, holding her gloved hands in his. "But I can promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to respect your calling as you respect mine, to love you for exactly who you are." Tears froze on Beatrice's lashes as she accepted. That night, they announced their engagement at the town Christmas celebration, where they received more congratulations than condemnation, a Christmas miracle in itself. They were married in April 1880, when the mountain wildflowers began to bloom. Beatrice wore a simple ivory dress with trousers hidden beneath a private rebellion that made Miles smile when she whispered it to him during their vows. The ceremony was held in the meadow where they'd had their first picnic, attended by a surprising number of Silverton residents. After the wedding, they moved into a small house on the edge of town. Beatrice continued her medical practice while Miles expanded his horse training business. They faced challenges: disapproving visitors from neighboring towns, occasional vandalism of Beatrice's office sign, letters calling her an affront to proper womanhood, but they faced them together. By their first anniversary, Beatrice had established a women's health clinic that operated once a week from her office. Miles had built a reputation that brought clients from as far as Denver, and Mrs. Winters, who had once been their harshest critic, now frequently brought baked goods to their home, claiming that even unconventional marriages need sustenance. In the spring of 1882, Beatrice gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth, named for Miles' lost sister. As she watched Miles hold their infant with tears in his eyes, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That sometimes being shunned leads you exactly where you're meant to be," she replied. "If I had been accepted everywhere, I might never have come to Silverton, never met you." Miles smiled, the same smile that had first captured her heart nearly 3 years earlier. "Then I'm grateful for every closed door and narrow mind that sent you my way." As their daughter grew, so did Silverton's acceptance of its unconventional doctor. By 1885, Beatrice had trained 2 young women as nurses, establishing a small but respected medical practice that served the entire county. Miles had opened a proper horse ranch outside town, specializing in training gentle mounts for ladies and children. Their son, Thomas, was born in the winter of 1886, a difficult birth that reminded them both how precious and precarious life could be. As Beatrice recovered, Miles took over much of her practice, following her detailed instructions and bringing patients to their home for her to advise on treatment. This partnership, unusual for the time, became the foundation of their family life. They shared responsibilities, respected each other's work, and created a home where their children grew up believing that a person's worth lay in their character and contributions, not their conformity to society's expectations. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Miles surprised Beatrice with a journey back to the meadow where they'd first connected. Now it held a small cabin he'd built in secret, a retreat where they could escape the demands of their busy lives. "I've been thinking," Miles said as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, "about how far we've come, not just us but Silverton too." Beatrice nodded. "When I arrived, I couldn't walk down the street without being avoided like I carried the plague. Now I deliver half the town's babies." "You changed them," Miles said, "by being unapologetically yourself, by proving your worth through action rather than argument." "We changed them," Beatrice corrected, taking his hand. "Your acceptance gave others permission to accept me too." Miles shook his head. "I just recognized what was already there, a remarkable woman with the courage to be different in a world that demands sameness." As twilight deepened around them, Beatrice rested her head on her husband's shoulder, thinking of the lonely young woman who had arrived in Silverton all those years ago, so determined to prove herself that she'd forgotten how to hope for happiness. "To me, you're perfect," Miles had said on that fateful morning, words that had unlocked something long dormant within her, the possibility that being different wasn't a flaw but a gift. That true belonging came not from changing oneself to fit the world, but from finding those rare souls who saw your differences as strengths. "What are you smiling about?" Miles asked, brushing a strand of hair now streaked with silver from her face. "Just thinking that of all the patients I've treated, you were the one who truly healed me," Beatrice replied. Miles kissed her gently, the familiar touch still sending warmth through her after all these years. "Then we healed each other, doctor, and that's the greatest medicine of all." As stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, they remained on the porch, two people who had found perfection not in flawlessness, but in the courage to embrace what made them uniquely themselves, and in doing so, had created a love as enduring as the mountains that surrounded them.